Hello and welcome to the session on Women's Education in Pre-Independent India. It is often difficult to formulate an accurate depiction of history when addressing the role of women in India. The women of India were often illiterate and only had verbal communication skills, thus leaving little factual written data or hard evidence for future scholars to report on. Women in India have been experiencing different status since the inception of the civilization. We know that Indian society is very much conservative by nature, and in the past some kind of blind faith and age-old superstition stood against the female education. Though women form half of the civilization, the masculine principles made the life of women miserable. They were denied equal opportunities and importance as men. But the present generation has felt the virtue of female education. They do not hesitate to send their daughters to schools. Now, in India, we find women professors, lady doctors, lady scientists, lady politicians, and lady ministers. But a large number of women are still in dark. They should be educated in the interest of our national progress. So, now, women's education in India is one of the foremost concerns of Indian government. It is because the educated women have proved their potential. No one can ignore the fact that the educated women play a very significant role in overall development and progress of the country. At present, women hold a prominent position in the society. Since the prehistoric times, women were denied opportunities and had to suffer for the hegemonic masculine ideology. This unjustifiable and unwarrantable oppression had resulted in to a movement that fought to achieve the equal status of women in all over the world. Women education in India is a consequence of such progress, and this led to the tremendous improvement of women's condition throughout the world. Eradication of female illiteracy is considered as a major concern today. Women education in ancient India. The position of women in ancient India was vital. They had the right to take important decisions and were even allowed to choose their own husbands through the ancient system of Swayamprabha. A woman in the ancient Indian society was respected and was given due importance in the society. The Vedas find importance of the women philosophers and intellectuals of the Vedic period. In the Vedic period, women education in ancient India was prevalent. Indian women during the ancient times were said to be superior to men. Access to education was easy for the women in ancient times. Through the massive women education in ancient India, several women seers and thinkers originated. Gargi and Maitreyi are known for their versatile knowledge and intelligence. Women enjoyed the tremendous right to education and teaching. The women intellectuals in ancient India gathered eminence by participating in debates and discussions in the assemblies of erudite persons. In Vedic period, educational system was very developed and the main subject taught was the Veda. The Veda or 6 Vedangas were taught, including the performance of sacrifice, correct pronunciation, knowledge of prosody, etymology, grammar, and Jyotisha, or the science of calendar. Women education in ancient India produced women with significant authority. However, this status of women did greatly deteriorate before the British imperialist government would intrude on Indian customs and traditions. During the period between 200 BC and 1200 AD, women's education did receive an immense setback, as women were being married as young as 12 and were not privileged to Upanayana, the Vedic initiation. The combination of women getting married 5 years earlier than they had previously been getting married, and the biased dismissal and exclusion of women from religious traditions greatly hindered the education of women. At this point, only women in rich aristocratic families received a proper education that was similar to the education received by the boys. During the years of 1200 AD, 1800 AD, Muslim rule caused the literacy among women to rapidly decline. Furthermore, the prejudice against women's education became strong within society. Therefore, the education of women was initially at par with the boys, and many women were prominent learners to the point where they were able to have intellectual debates with men in a public atmosphere about the philosophical and metaphysical subjects. However, during the time of Muslim rule, the women lost many of their religious rights and started marrying younger, which devastated their educational processes and status. Women education in medieval India. Education in medieval India was influenced mostly by foreign invasions. Various traders and rulers came to India during the medieval period and brought their own culture, tradition, as well as learning process. Indian society imbibed that knowledge and introduced it among the people in the country. However, these foreign conquests resulted in the decline in women's status in the medieval period. In this period, women education suffered a lot. In the Vedic period, women were given equal rights. This happy situation deteriorated with time. The medieval societies were subjected to inequalities and they were oppressed too. Historically, the medieval period is attributed as the dark age for women in India. In the medieval India, women were introduced to Parda system. Moreover, several evils started in the society. Social evil practices such as child marriage, sati, jawar were put restriction on women education in India. By the coming of Buddhism, women were started to get more freedom. They were given the freedom of education and were offered more liberal approach. In the years that followed Muslim rule, the majority of Hindu and Muslim women that were educated learned the majority of their knowledge from home schooling. The Muslim women were expected to learn the teachings of the Quran, but at the same time were restricted from learning in school. The coming of Muslims aggravated the troubles of the women. Women were forced to practice zenana. They were prevented equal access to get education, though many missionary efforts were put forth to give girls a formal education through schools by institutions such as the church, missionary society. Many higher class prestigious families did not allow their daughters to attend, as it was against their religious instruction. Thus, the women's schools were mainly populated with lower class girls as well as Christians. This is contrary to the old system when women's education first started to decline, and it was only the wealthy and prestigious women that received an education. J. Drinkwater Bethune, who was a legal member of the Governor General's Council as well as the President of the Council of Education, opened a school for girls called the Hindu Baliga Vidyalaya in 1849. Out of the 93 girls who were attending this school in 1863, 3/4 of them were from the lowest class, thus showing the bias of the upper caste against female education that remained until the later years of the 19th century. Women's education was greatly hindered due to many social and religious biases. One example from 1836, which exemplifies this idea, is when William Adam wrote, "A superstitious feeling is alleged to exist in the majority of Hindu families that a girl taught to read and write will soon after marriage become a widow." This demonstrates the biases and myths against women's education when the idea of women's formal education was reprising in the Indian culture and society. This was also a time when the practice of sati still existed. Therefore, under this Hindu belief of education, for a woman to educate herself was inherent to her committing suicide, as widows would be forced to submit themselves to the flames of their husband's funeral pyre. Thus, for women who followed the Hindu religion, living meant only the fulfilling of the social roles they were expected to play. In the early 19th century, the first schools that were created for girls arose from the efforts of missionaries. However, they were soon rivaled by Indian reformers. Thus, the real advancements in women's education would not be seen until the second half of the 19th century, when the government offered financial support. Although financial efforts were put forth by the government, it was not until urban professional elites joined the reformers in supporting formal education for women. Still, the process was quite slow until finally in the 20th century, women began to design a curriculum and set up schools for girls. Therefore, it is evident that it was a combination of government support along with the cooperation of the professional elites and the reformers that led to the greater equality in Indian women's education. Women education in colonial India. The story of Rasundari Devi's life describes the effect that the British imperial government had on women's education in colonial India. Rasundari was born in 1809 AD at a time when the ideologies of Indian society were against women's education. Rasundari relates how the British imperialists had an effect on women's education in India. "I was angry with myself for wanting to read books. Girls did not read. That was one of the bad aspects of the old system. The other aspects were not so bad. People used to despise women of learning. In fact, all the women used to show a great deal of displeasure if they saw a piece of paper in the hands of a woman. But somehow I could not accept this." Rasundari's testimony is evidence of the positive effect that the British imperialists had on women's education and overall equality. The British government did not take any responsibility for girls' education until 1854 due to the strict social and religious neutrality. This was over 31 years after they accepted responsibility for men's education. Thus, societal ideologies of women's education were a delicate topic, making it difficult for the British imperial government to successfully improve equality for Indian women in education. Lord Dalhousie, who was Governor General of India from 1848 to 1856, put forth that no single change was likely to produce more important and beneficial changes than female education. This portrays the intent of the British imperial government to give women greater equality in education. as this would be beneficial to India as a country and as a society. Furthermore, an educational dispatch in 1854 from Sir Charles Wood, President of the Board of Control from 1853-1855, claimed that the importance of female education in India cannot be overrated, and we have observed with pleasure the evidence which is now afforded of an increased desire on the part of many of the natives to give a good education to their daughters. Unfortunately, this statement is not entirely true, as it is evident that many women were restricted by their religious traditions from going to school. The women that did go to school were predominantly lower class women or Christians. However, this is further proof of the intent of the British government to break societal ideologies of women's education and allow for greater equality. Y.B. Mathur claimed that there was little progress made by the British imperialists until 1902. However, this is inaccurate as it does not account for the social barriers that were being broken and redefined by the British imperialists. Results were not seen immediately in the development of women's education because the social barriers that were restricting women from a proper education had to first be broken in order for Indian families to allow their daughters a proper education. In 1854, there were approximately 626 women's schools with a total of 21,755 students. Although this was not a significant amount of women considering the total population, a shift in attitudes towards female education had taken place, impartially due to Lord Dalhousie's educational dispatch released in 1854. The Indians began to support female education as many of them wanted social and political reform, as well as social and financial mobility. The Education Commission in 1882-1883 supported women's schools with public funds, the payment of liberal grants in aid, the offer of the scholarships, the raising up of a class of women for teaching girls through various plans, etc. However, due to a period of financial stringency, the government could not immediately assign adequate grants. The Education Commission, headed by William Hunter in 1884, was an improved and reformed response to the failures of the Education Dispatch of 1854. However, it is evident through testimonies such as Rasundari Devi's that although measurable results were not initially seen, social barriers were broken in women's education, which was a positive change from when older women used to show a great deal of displeasure if they saw a piece of paper in the hands of a woman. The majority of the results became apparent when the British government transferred the responsibility of Indian education to Indian control. However, it was the institution of British policies that broke the social barriers of the past and allowed for many women's schools to be erected and for women to attain their equality in education. However, the education of Indian women in colonial India was greatly influenced by British colonial rule. A focus on women's education in India shows that British intrusion through enforcement of laws was beneficial to the Indian women's education. Although the efforts of the British imperialists were not realized immediately, they broke social barriers, enabling greater equality for Indian women. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. This particular unit is a detailed study which brings out some information about educational status of women in the pre-independent India. The first part depicts the status of women in the past and present India. The second part discusses the important space occupied by women in the ancient India. It clearly states how well educated were ancient Indian women. And the third part talks about the condition of female education in the medieval India. The change in the status of women is discussed in detail. Finally, the fourth part gives stress to the colonial interference in the realm of women education. Here, the point is how the British invasion helped the women education and what are the measures taken by them to improve the education of women. Now, you can try to answer the questions given here. How was the status of Indian women in the Vedic period? Why is the medieval period called as Dark Age for Indian women? Explain the colonial interference in the realm of women education. What were the steps taken by the British government to improve the women education in colonial India? Hope that you can go through the reference books for further reading. Perspectives on Indian Women, authored by Tiwari R.P., 1999, APH Publishers. Women Education in Ancient and Medieval India, authored by Sharma U. and Sharma B.M., 1995, published by Commonwealth Publishers. Hope that you have enjoyed the session. We will meet again with another topic. Thank you.